Okay, so we are reading Naomi Novik, A Deadly Education. Not sure, we stopped in the middle of the chapter. The senior boy was sitting at a table alone because he stole someone's room. And he said, a freaking mawmouth went by my room yesterday, headed upstairs. Didn't get that one, did you, hero? And I believe that's where we stopped. Murmurs and freaked out gasps went around us like an expanding ripple as everyone at the nearby tables overheard. The whole room was absolutely agog and watching the drama unfold. Some kids actually standing on benches to peer over other people's heads and see. Todd laughed a little hysterically. Yeah, I wonder where it's going to settle down. Keep out an eye at the supply room, everybody, he called out, turning to the whole room and spreading his arms wide and up to take in the kids leaning over from the mezzanine, a parody of a friendly warning. But yeah, Orion, we're so lucky to have you here protecting us. What would we do without you? It was almost down to the letter my own thoughts about Orion's heroic campaign, and even more obviously accurate after the last week. A soul eater in the junior res hall, mimics and siren spiders in the shop, manifestations and mawmouths in the library. Todd was right. There had to be a hole somewhere letting them through, a hole they'd forced through in hungry desperation. Orion didn't say anything back. He just stood there with egg literally on his face and blobs of porridge clinging to his hair, pale and bewildered. Everyone around was darting uncertain looks at him. I stood up and said to Todd, You'd sail right out of here, enclave boy, and let the mouse eat the kid in the room next to yours instead of you. That's what you'd do. But yeah, have a go at Orion. Sorry, did I miss why you have more of a right to live than anybody he's saved? More than Mika? How long did it take for him to stop screaming when you shoved him into the dark? Do you even know? Or did you just plug your ears and look the other way till it was over? The whole room had gone so deathly quiet I could hear Todd's gulping as he stared at me bloodshot. Everyone was probably holding their breath not to miss a single nonce of this magnificent escalation of gossip. I picked up my tray and turned round to Orion, who looked back at me still shut down, and I told him, Come on, we're getting another table. I jerked my head to Adya, too, who was gawking up at me herself, and she scrambled up and grabbed her own tray and fell in with me, darting looks at my face sideways. Orion did come after us, moving a little slowly. The only empty tables left were bad ones, far at the edges and right by the doors or under the air vents. Obviously, nobody had left the cafeteria a second early with this excitement going on. But as we were passing him, Ibrahim blurted into the total silence, El, we have room, and waved some of the kids at his table to slide over and make space for us. The senior bell went off then, and we sat down surrounded by the sudden burst of activity and noise of all the seniors jerking into motion at once, shoveling in the last of their food and grabbing their things to rush out. Todd went with them, weirdly separate from the rest, a ring of space left around him. Orion sat down on the end of the bench, empty-handed. Yakov was on the other side across from him. He picked up his napkin, hesitating, and I reached out and took it and shoved it at Orion. You're a mess, Lake, I said, and Orion took it and started wiping himself clean. Can anyone spare anything? I put one of my own rolls in front of him, and then one after another, every single one of the kids at the table started passing something down, even if it was just half a mini muffin or a section of orange. And a kid at the table behind us reached out and tapped me on the shoulder and handed me a carton of milk for him. The conversation at our table was completely dead at first. With Orion right there, nobody wanted to talk about the only thing anybody wanted to talk about. Adja was the one who got things moving. She finished drinking the milk from the bottom of her cereal bowl, and here that's standard, not bad manners. It's bad manners to drink the milk out of your cereal bowl? I always do that.
I do it too.
It's like a waste of milk otherwise.
Would I do it at a restaurant? I don't know. Would you slurp it out of the bowl at the restaurant?
No, that might be a little...
Yeah.
But I would at like my college cafeteria.
Yeah, I would too.
So...
It's a little different than a restaurant.
I don't know. Maybe the English have better
English,
manners.
Yeah, there you go. They know where the spoon goes.
I guess. and wiped her mouth and said, "Any of you doing Sanskrit? You're not going to believe what Elle got. Elle, you've got to show them." And I was even more grateful I'd petted my book so much and put it in the special sling, because I'd forgotten about it completely for a few seconds, and if it'd been in my book bag, I am absolutely sure it would have vanished on me. Baghdad Enclave! Ibrahim and 2 others yelped instantly the second I pulled it out. All the kids who know Arabic can spot books from the Baghdad Enclave 3 shelves away, and since they couldn't talk about the real news, mine did for second best. I had languages after breakfast, and Orion had alchemy. He put the rubbish from his piecemeal breakfast on my tray and bussed it for me, and then, just as we were going out the door, he said quietly, "Thanks, but I know you didn't mean it." "I did too mean it," I said, irritated, because now I had to work out why I did. Someone's always got to pay, but why should it be homicidal Todd over anyone else? You're stupid for letting down your side, but you're the one who wants it to be fair. Go to your lesson and stop looking for a quatch. That's hug again, remember? Okay. And I'm sure I'm not pronouncing it properly because I don't speak Welsh, and I think that's what it is.
I remember you mentioning it now, but I had no fucking clue. I already forgot it, and I will in about 5 minutes.
It irritated me even more that he actually shot me a grateful look before he headed for the stairs. Predictably, an Arabic worksheet appeared on my desk the instant I sat down that morning. There wasn't a single word of English on it. The school didn't even give me a dictionary. And judging by the cheery cartoonish illustrations next to the lines, most notably a man in a car about to mow down a couple of hapless pedestrians, I had the strong suspicion that it was modern Arabic, too. I should have got a book on classical Arabic out of the library before going to class. When you've been exposed to a language you didn't really mean to start, you're better off giving in and just establishing some boundaries. I'd been just a bit busy yesterday. I'd already been resigned to my fate, though, and a Saudi girl who'd been at Ibrahim's table that morning had a booth near me. She lent me her dictionary in exchange for a promise to proofread her English language final paper. I copied out the alphabet into my notebook first and then started slogging away on the worksheet, copying out every word I looked up. And for a silver lining, I also couldn't understand a single word of the venomous tirade that the booth voice poured into my ears in between grudgingly telling me how to pronounce an Arabic word on the page, and I have no idea how to pronounce it. It doesn't even look, there aren't even any letters, so I'm not even going to try. And another Arabic word. I imagine It was full of particularly juicy horrors. It's the print is so tiny, I can't even hardly see it. That's it right there. It just looks like a little scratch.
Yeah, it's because it's a book.
Yeah.
I mean, you wouldn't be able to read it either way because it's in Arabic, but...
Yeah, but it's like I can't even see the letters. I mean, I know they're letters. I just don't recognize any of them. Anyway. There was a lot of other non-magical whispering going on around me for the rest of the day among the other kids. It occurred to me, much too belatedly, that I just graduated from pathologically rude bitch to enclave hater. It's not that we don't all know it's unfair, but nobody says so. Because if you say so, enclavers don't invite you to join them on the better side of the unfair. Orion's shrine might have gone off too if enough enclave kids decided Todd was right. Maybe the 2 of us would end up sitting up alone. That would be epic. My unpopularity massive enough to drag down Orion Lake himself. It didn't look good when I first got to the cafeteria at lunchtime. None of the enclavers who'd been making up to me lately said a word. No more study group invites from Sarah today. But as I came off the food line, Adja got there from shop with 3 other Artificer Track kids and waved to me on her way into the line. "Save us seats, Elle," she called across the room. Nkoyo and her pals, who were a few kids behind me, heard her. I don't know if that made the difference or not, but she said, "I'll get us water if you do a perimeter." And though Joanie and Cora exchanged slightly anxious looks, they followed her lead. By the time I'd set the perimeter and we were sitting, Adja and her crew were there, and they'd even gotten me an extra piece of cake to say thanks, the way that you normally do when you ask someone to save you a place. Not that I had any personal experience before now, as people previously had made their excuses if I asked them. Lou came too, and sat down quietly on my other side. She was still carrying a faintly shell-shocked expression, incongruous with the actual color in her face, which had shifted at least 10 degrees over on the spectrum from undead to just pale. Even her hair had hints of brown in it under the sun lamp. Did you do a UV potion, Lou? Asked one of Adja's friends.
Nope.
You look great.
Uh-huh.
Thanks.
I'm just
she
not
said.
eating hamsters anymore.
Exactly, or gerbils or whatever.
Well, we're going to find out soon, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Over her food. There almost wasn't room when Orion and Ibrahim arrived from lab. A couple of people shifted to let him sit next to me without so much as a word. I was mostly resigned to that, too. After my performance this morning, people would now assume that we were dating, even if I tipped his soup over his head. And if he actually did start dating someone, everyone would have us in a love triangle for the year.
Nice.
Todd was in the cafeteria, too. He already wasn't being frozen out completely. A group of loser freshmen had taken seats at the end of his table. He'd probably have a new alliance in time for graduation if his old one just didn't swallow it and take him back and leave it for the grown-ups to deal with when they got out. Maybe they wouldn't. His parents were powerful and important if his alliance had the right to offer a guaranteed in to the Enclave, which they would have needed to get the class valedictorian. He'd tell them about the mawmouth going past his room and they'd understand. Of course he had to protect himself. It wasn't like he'd really committed murder. Mika was going to die anyway, in a week. It made sense to trade him for an Enclave kid, a kid who had a chance, a kid who had a future. Just thinking about it made me angry enough to want to push Todd into the dark myself. I didn't have a concrete plan for work period, but without even saying it, I'd more or less assumed Orion and I would go to the library again together. But as we were bussing our trays, he said to me abruptly, "Go ahead, I'll find you." "Suit yourself," I said, shortly. There wasn't any great stroke of genius needed to guess what he was planning to do. But I didn't tell him he wasn't going to find a mawmouth lurking anywhere in the school, or that he was a moron for trying. I just went into the library alone. I meant to go to my desk, but when I came in through the reading room, the place was half empty. Most of the tables and squishy chairs had been badly scorched, and there was a lingering stink of smoke mingled with something smelling a bit like the cafeteria Brussels sprouts. Well, that doesn't sound good. They're the one thing that's never, ever poisoned. Well, they're yummy, so you should eat them. But even taking all of that into account, the place was never poisoned. No, wait a minute. I skipped a line. The place was unusually deserted. There were freshmen with actual seats instead of just being on the floor. After a moment, I realized that everyone was probably thinking, accurately as it happened, that if you were a hungry mawmouth, the library would be the perfect hunting ground. Probably anyone who wasn't desperate would also avoid the stockroom, exactly as Todd had suggested. It was too good an opportunity to pass up. "Move on," I told one of the more ambitious freshmen, who dared to snag one of the coveted armchair and desk combos in the corner that was normally filled with kids from Dubai Enclave, none of whom were in evidence at the moment. The kid gave it up without a fight. He knew he'd been reaching. "Can I sit by you?" he asked. That was new. Probably he was betting Orion would turn up. "Sit yourself," I said, and he shifted to the open patch of floor next to the chair. The seat back had a bad rip in the upholstery from one corner to the other, but that was why I'd wanted it. I dug the remnants of a half-scorched throw blanket out from under a sofa and got to work on it with my crochet hook. It took most of work period and a few layers of enamel off my molars, but I got the end of the blanket back into a raveled state. Then I folded it up into a pad, tied it over the rip with some stray bits of string, and sacrificed the whole thing and the mana I'd built up to do a make and mend on the chair back. I made sure to scribble L on the repaired bit. The unwritten rule is, if you fix a broken piece of school furniture, you get dibs on it for the rest of the term. The rule goes out the window often enough when there's someone else more powerful on the other side, but I suspected that not even Enclavers were going to want to pick a fight with Orion Lake's girlfriend, even if she was an Enclave-hating weirdo and he turned out to be saving losers at their expense. Afterwards, I took out the Golden Stone Sutras, petted the book lovingly for a bit, and then spent the rest of work period hunting up a classical Arabic dictionary so I could start translating the first few pages. Those turned out to be just the usual forward bits, like offering acknowledgments and thanks to various important patrons. In this case, senior wizards at the Enclave, and talking about how hard it had been to make a precise copy. It wasn't what you'd call brilliantly productive, but I got some Arabic practice in, which was just as well, since it was an absolute certainty that a quarter of my language final was going to be in Arabic. Oh, and they're on like the last 2 weeks of school, so that really sucks.
Yeah.
Orion never showed. He even skipped lab that afternoon. I didn't see him again till I got to the cafeteria for dinner, and he was already there, alone at a table, eating like a wolf from a loaded tray. He'd clearly been first into the line, which is a great way to get plenty of food, and also get eaten yourself. For most people. I didn't ask him where he'd been, but I didn't have to. Ibrahim wasn't even in our lab section, and he'd still heard Orion had skipped class. He was asking why before he had even gotten to his seat. I didn't find it, Orion said, low, after everyone else finished making the appropriate shock noises, when he admitted he'd gone hunting the mawmouth. It was insanely stupid, even for our hero. He only shrugged it off. I checked the supply room, the shop, all over the library. I was eating on, determined to ignore his catalog. But Lou, who was next to me, eating almost as mechanically, slowly began to lift her head from over her food as he talked. And when he finished up in frustration, she said, sounding a bit more like herself, "You're not going to find it." Orion looked over at her. A mawmouth wouldn't be hiding. If it was in the school, it would be eating. We'd all know where it was by now. So there isn't a mawmouth at the school. Either Todd made it up, or he hallucinated it. Everybody loved that idea, of course. He did say he hadn't been sleeping, one of Nkoyo's friends said, and by the end of the meal, the whole cafeteria had talked the mawmouth out of existence and Todd into temporary insanity, to enormous and general relief. Even mine. At least they'd all stopped talking about it now. And with the mawmouth disposed of, my find became real news at last. By the end of dinner time, 14 kids, 8 of them seniors doing Sanskrit, had come by to take a look at the sutras, and they got so excited that some other seniors who weren't doing Sanskrit came over to express interest. They are mostly kids from wizard groups, roughly like Lou's family, just a bit bigger, starting to get into reach of the resources to build an enclave. Getting the phase change spell for relatively cheap would be a substantial savings. I went back to the library after dinner, pleased despite the shed load of Arabic work I still had to do. Ibrahim even volunteered to help me out with the translations in exchange for English help that he really didn't need, which was clearly meant as an apology for being a twat previously. I took it, if a little grudgingly. I had sat down at his table, after all. He and his pal Nadia, the girl who'd lent me the dictionary earlier, came to the library with me after dinner. The reading room was already filling up again, and the Dubai kids didn't look at all happy when I came over and said, "My chair, thanks," to the kids sitting in it. Clearly, the shine was off me, at the very least. But I was right. They didn't try to pick a fight over it, or Ibrahim and Nadia staking out places on the floor next to it. They just shuffled themselves around, so the kid who'd lost the seat got another one in the adjusted pecking order and, pointedly, ignored us. I didn't mind. They still talked to each other, a lot, in Arabic. I couldn't pick out words yet, but just getting the rhythm of a language helps, and getting to eavesdrop on a big group of people talking is a fair bit nicer than having to listen to whatever the Scholomance would be pouring into my ears. I managed to slog through my Arabic worksheet and made some notes on cards for the grammar. Then I started translating the footnotes to the phase control spell. I'd been hoping for something useful, ideally casting tips. The older a spell is, the more likely your unconscious assumptions about stance and intonation are likely to be off. And the more powerful a spell is, the more likely awful things are going to happen as a result. But instead, it was all nonsense about how the phase control spell was included only for completeness' sake, as of course that particular spell had just been superseded by a new Arabic language spell. Right. As far as I know, nobody's ever made a phase control spell that works even half as well as Purachana's. That's why it was relatively popular in circulation, though it's in highly antiquated Sanskrit. I had a strong suspicion that this new Arabic version had been written up by a senior Baghdadi wizard that the translator had been trying to butter up. I translated every word of the flattery, hoping there might be one useful thing hidden among the rest. We're up here, Cat. Oh, the girls are fighting again. But no, at least doing the work definitely helped to settle the book down. So, for everyone listening still, we have two cats that are their sisters, and just every once in a while they decide to hate each other. Okay, I'm gonna go back a little bit. I translated every word of the flattery, hoping that maybe there would be one useful thing hidden among the rest, but no. At least doing the work definitely settled the book down. I kept stroking the cover and murmuring each word I translated out loud, and by the end of the process, it was starting to feel comfortable under my hands, like it was mine instead of something I'd just come across. Orion came in around then for making up his lab work. The Dubai kids eyed him a little hesitantly, sharing looks I could interpret perfectly well. Even if Orion was taking away some of your advantages as an enclaver in the larger scheme of things, in the smaller scheme of things, you were an individual still and wanted him to sit in your corner and just in case. For example, if a grab bag of mouths exploded into the library again. After a moment, one of the seniors gave a quick jerk of her chin to a sophomore, who got up and said casually, "I'm going to bed. Orion, have my chair. Good night, everyone," and took off. The rest of them also switched to English on a dime and started it on the usual round of thanking Orion for saving their lives in the library yesterday, until I broke in and said, "Give it a rest. He doesn't need strokes. Did you manage to actually do any work today, Lake? Or are you trying to be the first person to entirely fail out of the Scholomance?" She needs to work on her flirting, I think.
That's the opposite of flirting.
Yeah, I think, yeah. Anti-flirt. He rolled his eyes as he dropped into the chair. He didn't even notice it as anything special. It must have happened to him so regularly. And said, "Thanks for the concern. I did fine. Nobody was trying to burn my face off in the lab this time." Everyone in earshot, including Ibrahim and Nadja, eyed me in a sort of irritated and baffled way at the same time. A couple of the Dubai girls said something to each other in Arabic, which practically didn't need translation. Yes, obviously Orion was some kind of masochistic nutter dating me. I'd have to restrain myself severely from snarling at all of them that he wasn't dating me, thanks, and he should be so lucky at that. I stayed for another hour, mainly out of spite. I'd crammed as much Arabic as I was going to absorb that day, and most of my other work required things that were back in my room, not to mention I needed to be doing some mana building. But I just hung out, adoring my beautiful book and sniping back and forth with Orion. I'd like to claim I couldn't bring myself to go, but I have quite well-developed willpower when it comes to doing necessary work. I just have very little willpower when it comes to indulging petty resentment. I wanted to stay until enough of the Dubai kids finally did go to bed that there was a different chair left open, so I wasn't giving any of them anything. But I'm more embarrassed to admit that it never crossed my mind to consider what the cozy situation looked like to someone who might be watching. For instance, from the New York corner across the reading room. As far as they could tell, I'd finally taken one of those many dangled enclave invites, and Orion had in fact trotted after me, and now we were comfortably ensconced in the Dubai corner with some of those loser kids I'd recruited. Dubai wouldn't have been a crazy choice at that. The enclave there is relatively new and highly international. It's got a top-notch reputation for English and Hindi incantation, plus they recruit a lot of artificers and alchemists. Ibrahim, it also made perfect sense as a connecting point. His older half-brother was in the UAE, doing work for the enclave already, and he'd probably get invited aboard, too, if Ibrahim helped them bag Orion. So it was an obvious conclusion for the New York kids to draw, and if I'd thought about it, their response would have been equally obvious. As I hadn't thought, I just sat there like a prat down at the pub with my mates, and didn't pay the slightest attention when Magnus walked by us to go to the alchemy aisle near us, even though he'd absolutely no business going into the stacks at all when he could send any of his 6 hangers-on to fetch him any book he wanted. I doubted he'd have done it on his own initiative alone. They'd surely been talking options amongst themselves. How do you solve a problem like Galadriel? And I bet Todd came into it too. It was one thing for the New York kids to desert him, and another for a loser girl like me to rip into him in the cafeteria in front of everyone. And then to take Orion off to Dubai the very same day, after he'd already power shared with me and, as Chloe clearly thought, got me an incredibly powerful spell book. I do have to give Magnus credit. The crawler was a really good one. It would have absolutely got me, too. I can't even pretend. It was made of paper, a little crumpled twist, covered with looked like at a glance math equations instead of animating inscription. The library was full of scrap paper on a good day, much less right after a massive attack that had destroyed dozens of books and thrown kids' papers every which way, and lots of scraps sort of move on their own anyway. I actually noticed it moving vaguely in my direction and didn't think about it again. I didn't even have my usual baseline shield up because I was sitting in the reading room in the library with a good line of sight and lots of other eyes watching, and I needed to save every drop of mana that I could. If I'd been sitting in an ordinary chair, or if I'd been working hard with my feet planted on the ground, the crawler would have been able to get to the bare skin of my ankle, and 1 second afterwards it would have sent a heap of magic fibers corkscrewing into my flesh. That sounds really painful. Yep. And there wouldn't have been anything I could do to stop it from sucking the life straight out of me. But because I was demonstrably curled up in my nice comfy chair, with my feet tucked up underneath me, it had to come up the chair leg and go over the arm. Orion happened to be looking at me in time to grab me and yank me out sprawling over the floor, in front of the whole Dubai crowd, just before he disintegrated the crawler, incidentally along with 3/4 of my lovely repaired chair. I figured out what had happened almost instantly, especially since Magnus was just sitting back down in the New York corner. Everyone was looking over at me and Orion, the way you do when something explodes into flames unexpectedly, but he and several other New York kids were just a bit slow looking over, and they looked fairly grim about my visible survival. Not that I had any proof, of course. And there was Orion smugging down at me with deliberately obnoxious cheer. So that makes 8, right? Just asking to be told that it didn't count because it was his own arseholish friends trying to murder me. Thanks loads, I said through my teeth. On that note, I'm going to bed. I held my sutras against my chest. Thankfully, I'd been holding them in my lap and studying my book bag by the one strap it had left, and stalked directly out of the reading room. It wasn't my way of saying thanks or of being rude, either one. I just had to get out of the library. I was angry at myself for being stupid and needing my life saved, and I was angry at the Dubai kids, and everyone else, too, for thinking Orion was a perverted loon for liking unsettling me. But most of all, I was angry at Magnus and Todd, and every last one of the New York Enclave kids, because they had given me an excuse, a gold-plated excuse to do something to them. They deliberately tried to kill me. By Scholomance rules, that gave me a right to do something to them. And if I didn't, they'd assume it was because I was afraid of them. They'd think I was agreeing with them, telling them that they were right to look at me and see just a piece of rubbish to be kicked out of the way. Someone who wasn't worth as much as they were. The tears of rage were already leaking out of my eyes by the time I got to the stairs. I was just lucky there were some other kids going down to the dorms, and I managed to keep at least one person in blurry sight along the way, until I finally got to my room and clanged the door shut behind me. I started pacing the room with the sutra still clutched to my chest. It was only 5 steps across and turn and go back, over and over. I couldn't meditate, and I couldn't even try to work. If I put my hands to pen and paper right now, I knew what would happen. A spell would come out. A spell like a super volcano. The rotten thing about having mum is, as a mum, I know how to stop being... Having mum as a mum is I know how to stop being angry. I've been taught any number of ways to manage anger, and they really work. What she's never been able to teach me is how to want to manage it. So I go on seething and raging and knowing the whole time it's my own fault, because I do know how to stop. And this time was worse because I couldn't make excuses for them. All these years, whenever someone took advantage of me, shoved me out of the way, left me exposed for their own benefit, at least I'd been able to do that. To tell myself that they were only doing what anyone would do. We all wanted to live, and we were all doing our best to make it out of here, to end up safe. no matter how mean and awful we had to be along the way. I was doing the same thing. I'd kicked a freshman out of a chair and spent mana to fix it so I could shove myself in with a bunch of kids who didn't want me. And because I'd been sitting there being rude and mean to them, I'd scared the New York kids. They needed Orion, that little buzzer on his wrist that brought him to their rescue if they ever did get into trouble. The power he dumped into their shared power sink. What right did I have to take that for myself 8 times and counting? Why did I deserve to live more than them? But I had an answer now. I hadn't pulled Malia, even with a knife in my gut. And I'd gone after a mawmouth to save half the freshmen instead of running away. And meanwhile, Magnus had tried to murder me because Orion liked me. And Todd had destroyed Mika because he was scared. And because I had that answer, I couldn't help thinking, actually, that I did deserve to live more than them. And I know nobody gets to live or not because they deserve it. Deserving doesn't count for a thing. But the point was, I now felt deep in my heart that I was, in fact, a better human being than Magnus or Todd. And hooray, all the prizes for me. But that wasn't helpful when what I actually needed were reasons why I shouldn't just wipe them out of existence. I went on pacing for what felt like an hour. My gut hurt, and I was wasting time and effort that could have gone into something useful, like schoolwork I should have been doing, or the mana I should have been raising. Instead, I built an elaborate fantasy of how Magnus would beg my forgiveness in front of everyone, and sob and plead for me to not flay him alive, especially after I tore a strip or two off just to start. And Orion would just stand by with his face angry and disappointed and his arms folded, doing nothing to help him, rejecting all his friends and his home for me. Every few minutes I veered rapidly over to feeling sick at myself and saying out loud, okay, I'm going to walk back and forth 3 more times and then I'm going to meditate. Trying to commit myself. And then I walked back and forth 2 more times and then I started over with the fantasy from the beginning, reworking it in my head. I even talked out some of the lines under my breath. I'm not a moron. I knew it was dangerous. I was on the edge of casting. That's all magic is, after all. You start with a clear intention, your destination. You gather up the power, and then you send the power traveling down the road, giving the clearest directions you can, whether it's with words or goop or metal. The better the directions are, the more well-traveled the road, the easier it is for the power to get to where you want it to go. That's why most wizards can't just invent their own spells and recipes. But I can blaze a trail to Mordor any time I want, and I still had 9 full crystals in my chest. So what if those ran out? There was loads of power to be had. After all, if Magnus deserved to die, why shouldn't I put his life to good use? And that thought is exactly why I knew I had to stop. I knew I had to let it all go, or else I'd become a much worse person than Magnus and Todd and Jack all put together, and no more prizes for me. But I knew it, the way you know the 6th biscuit in a row isn't good for you, and you'll be sorry, and you're not even really very nice, and yet they are not even really very nice, and yet you keep eating them anyway. I know exactly what that's like. That's why I opened the door when Adja knocked. I did check who it was, and kept well back this time. I wasn't getting caught the same way twice, but I let her in, even though I didn't want company after all. At least having her there would make it harder for me to keep cramming the biscuits of revenge fantasy into my mouth. Yeah? I said shortly, but not outright rude. My idea of self-restraint at the moment. Aja came in and let me shut the door. She didn't answer for a moment, which was odd for her. She doesn't dither. She looked round the room. It was the first time she'd ever come over. It was the first time, apart from Orion and Jack, that I'd ever had anyone over. In fact, at most, a few people have come round to swap things with me, and on those occasions they didn't come in far enough for the door to close behind them. My room's pretty Spartan. I spent my freshman year turning my cupboard into wall-mounted shelves, which are massively safer than any piece of furniture that has enclosed areas and a dark underside. I got shop credit for it. I stripped my desk drawers for the same reason, traded for metal, and reinforced the legs and top of the desk instead, which was why it had survived the incarnated flames visit. I got a wobbly and rusted metal rack on top for papers that I also made myself out of the easiest metal I could get. Nothing else besides the bed and the tool chest at the foot that I used to hold everything important enough that it'd probably disappear if I left it lying around. Most kids have at least a few decorative bits here and there, a photo or cards on display. People give pottery and drawings at New Year. I've never been given any, and I don't waste my own time making them. It didn't feel bare to me, but I grew up in a one-room yurt with a couple of boxes under our bed and Mum's work table under the one round window. Except there I had the whole green world outside the door, and here this was clearly the room of a miserable loner, someone like Mika, who couldn't even afford the risk of cupboards. It made me even more furious looking at it through another person's eyes. Magnus probably had a quilt and a spare pillow, made sometime in the last 30 years by another New York student who'd passed them down on graduation day. His walls were probably covered with cheery cards and pictures people had made for him, or even actual wallpaper if he'd wanted it enough. His furniture would be polished warm wood with warded locks on the drawers and cubby holes. Maybe he had a keep fresh larder box. He certainly had a proper desk lamp. His pens never disappeared on him. I could go and find out. Magnus would be in his room by now. It was close to curfew. I could force my way in and tell him I knew what he tried to do to me, and then I could shove him into the dark. Not like Todd had done Mika, not all the way in. Just enough to make it clear that I could do it. Anytime I want to, I could push him in and take his lush, comfortable room all for me, since he and his enclave buddies thought it was the sensible thing to do to another human being. I had my hands clenched again, and I'd almost forgotten Aja was there when she said abruptly, did you take out the Mawmouth? It was like having a bucket of just melted ice thrown all over me. My eyesight actually fuzzed out a bit, going dim. For a moment I was back inside the Mawmouth again, the horrible, pulsing, wet hunger of it, and I lunged from the middle of the room and threw up into the floor drain, heaving up wet chunks of my half-digested dinner burning with stomach acid. The feeling of them in my mouth made me heave again, sobbing in between rounds. I kept going until I was empty, and for a while afterwards. I was vaguely aware that Aja was holding my hair back out of my face. My plate had come undone. When I stopped, she gave me a cup of water, and I rinsed and spat over and over until she said, "This is the last of the jug." And then I made myself sip a little, trying to wash the last bile back down my throat. I crawled a few steps back from the drain and eased myself against the wall with my knees pulled up and my mouth wide open, trying not to smell my own breath. "Sorry," Adja said, and I raised my head and stared at her. She was sitting on the floor just a little away from me, cross-legged with the jug in her hands. She was in her pajamas already, or what passes for that in here, a ratty pair of too small shorts and a long-sleeved top let out with cheap mending, like she'd got herself ready for bed and had been about to get in, and then instead had come to ask me. "You did, didn't you?" she said. I wasn't in any state where I was going to think through what the right answer was or what it would mean to tell her. I just gave a nod. We sat there for a bit and didn't say anything. It felt like a long time, but the curfew bell didn't ring, so it couldn't have been. I still couldn't think at all. I just sat there, existing. Eventually, Adja said, "I started on a mirror for next quarter. I asked Orion what he did to the poor to make it come out so great. He said he didn't do anything special. He's not a very good alchemist anyway. He's just doing it, you know." Then I remembered that you had used some kind of incantation after the enchantment, so I tried to find it, except all I found was a section in my metals handbook that said, "Using incantations to smooth the poor is stupid, because that's trying to force your will into the materials against their nature, and almost nobody can do it unless they're really powerful, so you shouldn't bother trying." It didn't make any sense anyway. You're an incantations track junior, but you got assigned a magic mirror? That doesn't happen. I gave a snort, more than half a snuffle. My nose was running. Happens all the time to me. Adja kept going, talking faster. She sounded almost angry. "That phase control spell. You said you burned through it in a couple of hours after dinner. Meanwhile, the seniors who are thinking about bidding, they're all discussing if they can even learn it in time for graduation. Besides, that whole book is a crazy big deal. Luck like that doesn't just happen. You had to do something really horrible to get it, are really amazing, and you were so wiped out Sunday, and Todd wasn't hallucinating, by the way. A mouth is the only thing that would have freaked him out that hard. He could survive anything else. Then she asked, "Where'd you get the manna?" I didn't want to talk. My throat was really sore. I reached over to my little box and opened it and showed her my crystals, the 2 cracked ones and the dull, drained ones next to the primed empties and my last 9 full crystals. "Push-ups," I said briefly, and shut the box again and put it away. "Push-ups," Adya said. "Sure, why not? Push-ups." She let out a bray of a laugh and looked away. "Why aren't you telling anyone? Every enclave in the world's going to be drooling over you." The half-accusation in the words made me angry, and I want to cry at the same time. I got up and got my little half-full jar of honey off my shelf. I take it to meals every weekend for the chance of a refill, but it's hard to get, so I use it sparingly. But this called for it. I whispered Mum's throat-soothing charm over the small spoonful and washed it down with the last lukewarm swallow of water in the glass, before I turned back to Adya and stuck out my hand, mockingly. "Hi, I'm Elle. I can move mountains. Literally. Do you believe me?" Adya stood up. "So you do a demo! You should have done one freshman year, and asked some of the enclavers to spot you the manna. They'd be fighting to have you on their team." "I don't want to be on their team," I yelled hoarsely. "I don't want to be on their team at all." Chapter 9. Unknown. And I'm gonna stop because we only have a minute left.
Okay, your choice.